I've vacillated a little bit about what material to cover in this lecture. And I just uploaded, those of you who are looking on the Facebook page, I guess, at the slides, you notice that 5 minutes ago we changed them. So this is a huge file here, probably 53 slides. I won't use them all, but I added some to what I had distributed a few days ago. And then I have another set that I might look at as well. So first I'm going to talk a bit about, I think Professor Vasser-Helge certainly and some of the others might be expecting me to talk about Dempster Schaefer theory, because that, of course, is what my name is associated with, and we have people in the department that are using it. So I thought I'd talk a little about that, but I'd also talk about the research that I've done more recently. So I'm going to start by talking a bit about the research I've done, the teaching I'll be doing in the future, so you'll be informed about that. So the first part of this talk is, I say a little bit about the book I published 40 years ago. This is the 40th anniversary of my book on Dempster Schaefer belief functions. I'll talk briefly about their application to accounting and about the relation to game theoretic probability, which is a topic that I've spent a lot of time on. Well, I'm spending a lot of time on currently, and I've spent on the last 20 years. And then I'll talk about some general philosophy of how how we get from evidence to probability or belief, degrees of belief, or which really involves thinking about betting. And then I have an extended example of Dempster Schaefer that might be informative to you. Let's see, which work? Good. Oh, you gotta install it. So, I'll explain the name Dempster Schaefer. When I was a graduate student in 1970, I met a person I now consider a friend, Art Dempster. We're still in touch. He was born in 1929, which makes him 86. So I've known him for a few years. And then some years later, I published a book that used some of his ideas. And the resulting theory is popularly known as the Dempster Schaefer theory. I didn't use the term Dempster Schaefer theory. Somebody else invented that, but it's kind of very widely known now. I called the theory of belief functions, and the title of my book was A Mathematical Theory of Evidence. So if you see references to a mathematical theory of evidence or Dempster Schaefer theory or belief functions, they're probably talking about this book. And it's still quite popular. The ideas in it, I think they're both popular and controversial. But to show you how they continue to be popular, I'd comment that in 2010, which was already 34 years after the book was published, a group of scholars founded a society for the study of those ideas. They call it the Belief Functions and Applications Society. So both Dempster and I attended the first meeting of that society in France in 2010, and it is still meeting and having, it's got an organization and meetings. The next meeting of that society will be in November in Prague, the Czech Republic. So here are a couple people who are working on applications in accounting, continuing to work on applications in accounting. And you probably know their names. Peter Gillett is a professor here at Rutgers. His office is in New Brunswick, but he sometimes comes to our seminar. Well, you often see him. I'm sure you've met him. He did his PhD with Professor Srivastava at the University of Kansas. And Professor Srivastava is probably the most active scholar in this area. If you look on his website, you'll see a list of 48 publications on belief functions applied to accounting. Some of them are co-authored by me, but those go back to the 1980s, and he's continued to work in this area. I gave you some assigned readings. One of them was with Raj, the first paper we published together on this in 1990. So I guess, we did the work in the 80s, but we didn't publish it until 1990. And then we continued publishing some other papers together. This is a much earlier paper from 1978, which has an extended example that I will spend some time on today, probably. This is a paper about how to use similar ideas in decision making, not by me, but by some colleagues. David Krantz is a professor at Columbia, and Howard Kuhnreuther is a professor at the Wharton School in Philadelphia, University of Pennsylvania. So I'm not going to talk about that paper today, but I will in a course that I teach next year. And this is an introductory paper to game theoretic probability, which I'll also talk about today. So some more references. My book on game theoretic probability, which as I said, I'll also talk about, this is so in my mind, although this is not as well known as the Dempster Schaefer theory, for me, it's a more general foundation for a lot of applications of probability, a lot of mathematics of probability, a lot of applications of probability, and Dempster Schaefer. It's a very general way of looking at this whole area of probability judgment. So that's already 15 years ago. I was just talking with Professor Helye how we continue to age. You're the younger generation. I'm starting to think now about the famous people that I knew when I was first a graduate student in the 1970s, who are long gone. So you guys will be teaching accounting long after some of the rest of us have departed. But since 2001, that's 15 years ago, we've written a number of other papers, and we haven't given up. We've learned a lot, and we're writing a second edition of this book. I mentioned this idea of game theoretic probability, and I'll explain to you what a probability game is. Has lots of applications. You can use it to understand statistical testing. That's number one. It gives a whole new way of understanding statistical testing. You can use it as a way of doing forecasting, giving probabilities for what will happen next. You can use it for probability judgment, and that's where the Dempster Schaefer theory and Bayesian ideas come in. You can use it to model causality. A lot of people are interested in looking at causes of things. And you can use it in finance. So a lot of my audience, in recent years, as you know, I was dean for 4 years, so I wasn't teaching at all. But before that, I was teaching a lot of finance. So this theory is also relevant to modeling financial markets. So as you can see, it's theory of everything. So this has a link. I just got back from Germany, where I gave a series of 10 lectures at a center called the Center for Mathematical Philosophy at the University of Munich. And this is a link. You can click on that and you can get slides for my 10 lectures there. So for the lecture for today, I kind of took mostly these slides from. I mainly took. If you put them on our website.
You have them already.
No. You can get them from there.
Yeah, I'll ask him to do it.
But I intend to revise them. So.
Okay. When you revise us, you give the new ones.
Okay. And other places you can learn more about this. I don't think this is not a course I would expect the students here to take. But next fall I am teaching a very mathematical version of this theory to the graduate students in the statistics department at Rutgers in New Brunswick. The prerequisite for that course will be a first course in measure theoretic probability. That's a little bit far out for applied students. So I just want to let you know I am teaching that. But then in the spring, I'm going to teach a course here in our program called the Theory of Evidence that will be more general and touch on a lot of the things that I'm talking about today. So I invite you to consider this course and for your curriculum. It's on the RBS PhD program website for spring 2007. And this is just a week, but these are the titles. There's a syllabus there on the RBS website, and these are just the weekly. Sorry, what? This is. Everything is forward, there's no backward. Oh, there it is. Okay, so that's my course for spring 2017. Okay. Now, okay, so I'm going to talk now a little bit about using about probability judgment. Here I call it from evidence to bets. So how do we start with evidence and make probability judgments? So I have some pictures of old guys here, really old guys. Here's somebody that was born in 1640. So it's just to say that these folks actually, the simple rules I'm going to tell you, which are rules of Dempster Schaefer theory, were not actually invented by Dempster and Schaefer. They were invented long before the more popular probability theory was invented. Let me ask you a question. How many of you have heard the term Bayesian probability or Bayesian statistics? How many have not heard that term? One is not. What is Bayesian?
You say Bayes?
Bayesian.
Yeah. Okay. I see.
Sometimes we'll talk about Bayes' theorem. Or Bayesian statistics, or Bayesian arguments, or Bayesian models, Bayesian analyses. So the Bayesian methodology is a way of using probability theory. It's widely used now. It's still somewhat controversial. When I was young, it was very controversial. And this Dempster Schaefer was an alternative to it. So you could have a Bayesian analysis, and then you could do a Dempster Schaefer analysis, was a different way of doing things. Yeah.
What the controversy about this?
Well, a lot of it had to do with the distinction between subjective or objective probability.
Okay.
So the usual thought of objective probability is that a probability is a frequency. The subjective probability idea was that probability is a belief. And when I was first a graduate student, it was still the idea of probability as frequency was very, very dominant. It's still, probability as frequency is still the way, you might still say it's dominant, but the idea that probability is belief and that you should use the Bayesian methods to update your beliefs has become more popular. The Dempster Schaefer approach was a different way to analyze beliefs. But the Bayesian methodology is an ancient way. It goes back to the 17th century, 18th century. So the Bayesian idea started in the 18th century, the 1700s. Actually, I'm claiming the Dempster Schaefer started in the 1600s, but it was forgotten. So I go back and dig up these old people and say, hey, we were already doing this. It's not so strange. So I was going to ask you to tell me what, I've kind of answered the question, what Bayesian methods were, but I was going to ask you what your impression was. How many of you have seen Bayes' theorem? You know what Bayes' theorem is? Where did you learn that? Where did you learn about Bayes' theorem? In a probability course where? Where did you take the probability course? Where? Where? In Rutgers? When? From whom?
From that Bush campus.
From Bush campus?
It's a master
We're taking
class.
we're taking it now. We're taking first year. It's basically the first year grad course in stats.
In the statistics department?
Yes, I think so. But it's pretty not theoretical. It's more like practical and then like not a lot of theory.
Who's your teacher? Palasa?
No.
No.
John.
Jones.
Jones?
John.
Doug?
John. Yeah. His last name is like K-L-I-N-C-E-W.
K-L-I-N.
C-E-W.
Oh, yeah. You gotta remember my name. My name is Glenn Schaefer. If you take my course, you need to remember my name. Okay, so is in that course, is Bayes' theorem treated as, is it explained that it's kind of controversial, or no? No, not treated as controversial. Well, it is a theorem, but the question is how it's used. The way it's used was something that could be considered controversial. So I wanted to draw a distinction between betting and assessment of evidence. There are really two different things that you somehow need to bring together. Probability is, in the first instance, I would argue that probability is about betting. That's where the theory of probability started. But the assessment of evidence is about weighing arguments and combining arguments. After you have combined the arguments, you might say, okay, on the basis of these arguments, let's say that on the basis of these arguments, we'll give odds of 2 to 1 for something being true. And I want to introduce to you the idea that when you give such odds, there's two ways of interpreting them. One way is to say that I would bet at those odds. I would give you those odds. I am putting my money where my mouth is. I think that this account receivable is collectible. I have a two-thirds probability on this account receivable being collectible, meaning if you want to bet with me, I'll bet you 2 to 1 that it's collectible. So that's one way of interpreting the probability. Another way of interpreting it is to stand back and say, this other guy gave these odds, and I don't think I can make money betting against his odds. So one way is that I offer the odds. The other way is that I don't think, I respect the odds. I don't think I have any way of making money betting against that person's odds or that theory's odds or so on. So this is, I use the word Cournot because there's a famous philosopher, mathematician from the 19th century named Augustin Cournot, Frenchman, who had an idea something like this. And it's not as familiar. This first idea that you would express your belief by offering the odds is better known, and it's associated with a mathematician named Bruno Di Finetti. So I always make these things Bruno, Italian. So one was a 20th century Italian, Bruno di Finetti. The other guy was a 19th century Frenchman, Augustin Cournot, and I'll talk more about these two ways of interpreting probability. But we've got to get to the probabilities. We've got to start with the evidence and put things together and come up with these probabilities. That's the idea. Historically, okay, so going back, repeating myself, when we assess the evidence, we usually we have a lot of evidence. Like you think of, in accounting, this is applied to auditing. So as an auditor, you have lots of different things you've looked at, lots of different testimony you've gotten, a lot of information about internal controls, information, analytical procedures, lots of information you gather together. So you think about that as different items of information. You decompose your evidence. You need to judge what each item of evidence is tending to tell you. You need to say how strong it is. Now, the idea here is, you assess your strength of your evidence by comparing it to a scale of examples. So if I wanted to measure this table, I could take a tape measure. And you could think of that as a scale of examples of length. Along that scale, there's 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet, 1 meter, 2 meters, centimeters. So we need a scale of examples. So a scale of examples might be, okay, I would offer you 1 in 10 odds, or I would offer you 3 in 10 odds, or I would offer you 50-50 odds. So you could think of these different possible bets as a scale of the strength of your evidence, and you're looking at the evidence and you're saying, well, I've seen things like this before. I think they're right about 70% of the time. You could think of it, or you could do 60, or you could do 65. So it's like a scale you're comparing your evidence to. But then you've got to have a design for how you compare this to. You use your scale to assess the strength of this evidence. You assess the strength of this evidence. Maybe the two pieces of evidence are saying the same thing. Maybe they're saying contradictory things. You need some design for putting them together. So the idea here is that Bayes and Dempster Schaefer are two theories that are giving us different scales of canonical examples and different designs. They're both using betting examples, they're both using betting games as the canonical examples, but they're doing it in different ways. So I cite one of the papers. I think I gave you this as a reference. 1985, I published a paper with some ideas like this with a famous but now already deceased Amos Tversky. Have you ever heard his name? Who has never heard of Amos Tversky? You've never heard of it?
It's prospect theory.
Pardon?
It's prospect theory.
Yeah, he and Kahneman. But he died of skin cancer about 20 years, pardon?
When?
20 years ago, 25 years ago. Yeah, maybe 25 years ago he died, at least 20 years ago. So Daniel Kahneman was awarded the Nobel Prize, who survived. It was Tversky and Kahneman that did this prospect theory, all these heuristics. So they were very famous for that, but Tversky died of skin cancer at what I now regard as a very young age.
He looks like a younger. Every year they look younger.
So anyway, I collaborated with him back, how many years ago was that? 30 years ago. And we had a paper on this kind of theme. So here's this. So I'm talking about canonical examples. So the simplest canonical examples is where you have one probability P, and you're going to scale by changing P. So there's a probability P for one thing happening and a probability 1 minus P for the opposite, the complement happening. The way the preference, I told you these, I was mentioning these two ways of interpreting probability. Well, where did I put them? I lost that slide. Oh, here it is, my slide, that you could say that you're inclined to bet, or you could say that you don't think you can beat the bet. It's a two-way. This is the one I like, so I should be clear about it, not to confuse you. I like the one where you're saying you can't beat the bets. Because this whole theory of game theory probability that I'm telling you relies on this one, that you can't beat the bets. And that's one of the things that distinguishes my point of view from the Bayesian point of view. Whereas the Bayesians are always talking about that I'm offering the bets. I'm expressing my belief by offering the bets. So that's what you'll hear most often. So my point of view is to say you can't beat the bets. So this simple canonical example, when interpreted that way, that we don't think this P, this probability P is, so we choose a P where we say we don't think this is beatable. Now, you're not going to get beat on one bet. So when we say it's not beatable, we're really referring to a larger system, or we think it's part of a system where you can't beat this theory or this method that is giving these probabilities. You think it's good enough that you can't beat it. But anyway, a given item of evidence we placed on this scale, choose a P that we don't think can be beat when it's part of a bigger system. The Dempster Schaefer canonical example takes this a step further. It starts with the probabilities P and 1 minus P that you don't think can be beat. And with probability P, you get A, with probability 1 minus P, you get B. But then, this is very abstract looking. But then there is a second step. There's a second step. There's some further information. We call that further information gamma. This is a Greek letter gamma. That little prime or something is just a typo. So that's just supposed to be the Greek letter gamma. And this information gamma, I call it a multivalued mapping here. That came from Dempster's original work. My friend and mentor, Art Dempster, talked about a multivalued mapping. And this multivalued mapping is mapping A, little a, to the event capital A. But it's mapping little b to A or not A. That's the multivalued part. So if A happens, this additional information tells us that capital A is true. But if B happens, this additional information tells us that we don't know. It could be A, it could be not A. When we put all this together, we got a probability P for capital A, but the 1 minus P doesn't go anywhere. So it's like we believe capital A to degree P, but we have zero belief for not A. That's the Dempster Schaefer idea. And it has these two steps in it. One is there's probabilities here, but then these probabilities get translated only partly into the A and not A. So here is an example from my 1990 paper with Srivastava. So you can read the example, and the point is the auditor has information from two sources about the collectability of an account receivable. So the account receivable, the client's credit manager, so there's two guys. There's Dick and there's Tom. So Dick is the client's credit manager. He works for the company you're auditing. But Tom is somebody independent who knows something about the party that owes the money. they both say 95% that they think it's collectible. So these are like two witnesses. But we think their information, their analyses come from different sources. The client's credit manager, that's Dick, he's relying on his experience with that customer, whereas Tom is relying on what the industry says about that customer. So one of them is relying on experience collecting money from the customer, the other is relying on the credit rating, the customer's industry, general knowledge about a different set of knowledge. Both of them say 95%, but we're going to evaluate both of them with this example. We've got two different 95%. One is a 95, we use this picture once for Tom and once for Dick. So in the case of Dick, we say Dick is a 95% reliable. So what Dick says is true, 95%. That doesn't mean that we think if Dick doesn't know what he's talking about, it doesn't mean that what he said is false. So that 5%, we don't say that goes, we don't take the 5% and say that means the account is not collectible, we just say that's don't know. So for Dick, we've got 95% is collectible, 5% we don't know. And for Tom, we have the same thing, but they're independent. So we put them together. And the idea of putting them together is we multiply the probabilities. So there's a 95% chance times 95% that both Dick and Tom are reliable. So a 90.25% chance they're both reliable. And in that case, the account is collectible. But also there's a chance that Dick is reliable and Tom is not. But it only takes one of them. If one of them is reliable, then it's collectible. So this 95 times 5 that goes towards being collectible, and the 5 times 95, that also goes towards being collectible. So we add all three of those together to get 99.75% chance the account's collectible. That's our idea. That's our degree of belief. It's only both of them. If both of them are not credible, if we don't want to, it's only that 5% times 5% that we say there's a 1/4 of 1% chance that neither of these guys knows what they're talking about. In that case, it might still be collectible, but we can't count that as a belief that it is collectible. So we end up with these very high odds for being collectible.
Sir, only one guy know it is collectible, but the other guy does not know. So how do you judge the? How do you know the conclusions that it is collectible?
Well, the idea is that if one of them is reliable, it's true. If either of them is reliable, it's true. Now, they didn't contradict each other. If they contradicted each other, then we've got a bigger problem. We got a bigger analysis to do. But they're saying the same thing. So if one of them is not reliable, it doesn't mean that the thing is false. It just means that we can't put any confidence in what he says. But we have one guy we do have 95% confidence in, that's enough.
So push up the probability.
So the probability that one guy is reliable and the other guy doesn't know what he's talking about, in that case, we say we believe it. So either one of them be reliable, either this or both of them reliable, all that probability goes to believing it. But if they're both not reliable, that probability doesn't go anywhere. That's the idea. So this is a rule. So this is a simple example of belief functions, but it's an example that's so simple that it's actually 400 years old. It was published by a bishop. An English bishop. Now, why was an English bishop writing about this kind of thing? Obviously, he was talking about religion. So he said, you have 4 Gospels, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all of whom told us about Jesus Christ. So if we believe Matthew to a certain degree and Mark to a certain degree, but they all said the same thing. So the evidence is piling up. That's what Bishop Hooper was concerned about, but we're concerned about analyzing auditing. different problem. So this is the general rule. This is the general design for Bishop Hooper's idea. You've got these two different probabilities that we both think are, these probabilities are unbeatable, but they tell us different things. Each story is irrelevant when we say they're independent. What do they mean by independent? So, actually, so I started talking this way, what I've just been telling, the story I've just been telling you. I started talking this way in the 1970s. And the biggest problem I had was people saying, what do you mean independent? What's that mean? I said, you know, this guy's credibility is independent of this guy's. Independent. Different items of it is different evidence, so we should be able to combine them by multiplying. And they say, where did that come from? They said, if we're Bayesians, we think we have a definition of independence. The Bayesian said, we have a definition of independence, we know when we can apply our rules, but you're just pulling this out of the air, this independence business. So I have spent 30 or 40 years thinking about this problem of what does it mean to be independent? And I finally decided that the answer was, you know, and so actually what I first did, so I'm making this autobiographical, this lecture. This is what happens when you get old guys. Right. So I spent many years thinking about, I'll put it this way. My reaction was to say, I know that when I say independent, I'm making some kind of additional judgment. We're trying to assess evidence. We have to make probability judgments. I'm making an additional judgment, but the Bayesians do that too. When the Bayesians decide to update by conditional probability, they're also making a judgment. So I went back and studied all these historical papers, including the original paper written by Thomas Bayes. They call it Bayesian because there was a guy named Thomas Bayes who published a paper in 1763. So that's only 250 years ago. So Bayes published this paper where he explained the methodology that's now called Bayesian. And so I went back and studied his paper, and I said, look, this is not all right. I said, here's where I have a problem with it. And it's the same problem as you've got with me. So I tried. So my idea was, it's got the same problem as you say Dempster Schaefer has. And then, you know, I studied that problem and what you needed to do to fix it for decades. And my friend, I'll tell you more about him, my friend Voff joined forces, and we did this game theoretic probability business, which we think is a better explanation of both approaches. And that came up with this idea of not being able to beat the probabilities. So what do I mean when I say that the two items of evidence are independent? I mean that learning this item of evidence doesn't help me beat the probabilities in this one, and vice versa. And that leads to a justification for the multiplication. So you end up, if I go back to this slide here, you see what I'm doing is I'm multiplying P1 times P2 and P1 times 1 minus P2 and 1 minus P1 times P2. And I'm adding all that up. And if you do the algebra, that comes out 1 minus P1 times 1 minus P2. This is 1 minus P1 times 1 minus P2. And this is 1 minus that. So the general rule, so this is the general rule, and I call that Hooper's rule. Right, so Hooper already did it, even before Bayes did. 100 years before Bayes came up with his rules, Hooper did it this way, and they disagree. They're different rules. This is not Bayesian. Now, Bayes is a different way of analyzing the problem, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying you got to look at your particular evidence to decide whether you want to do it this way or this way. That is probability judgment. There's no magic wand that says Bayes is always right or Bayes is always wrong, or Dempster Schaefer is always right or wrong. They're ways of analyzing, assessing evidence. So here is another example. This is also in the paper by with Srivastava in 1990. But let me pause. Any comments or questions about what I already did? Okay, so here's a different one. This one is where you got two stages. This is chain of testimony. So this is an auditing example. It's where the auditor asks the manager, and the manager asks a financial analyst. So you got two stages of doubt. Do we trust the financial analyst? And if we trust the financial analyst, if we think he's a good financial analyst and he knows what he's talking about, do we trust this client? Do we trust our client's credit manager to really be telling us accurately what the financial analyst said? Because the client, he's the client. The client has a vested interest in this, a conflict of interest. The client wants us to believe the account receivable can be collected. So he might fudge what the other guy told him. So you got two stages of doubt. So George Hooper, the Christian bishop, was also worried about this because, after all, if you look at the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Matthew didn't tell us. Matthew told somebody else, and somebody else told somebody else, and somebody else told somebody else, and it finally got to us thousands of years later. So there's a chain of testimony problem. So the chain of testimony weakens the evidence. If you've got a 95%, if there's 95% reliability that the financial analyst is reliable, but then you've only got a 95% belief that the client's credit manager is properly reporting what the financial analyst said, then you only got 95% times 95%. So you only end up with a 90.25%. That's the 95 times 95. All the rest of it you don't know. All the rest of it, somebody might be unreliable. You don't know. So now it's, instead of being 99.75 to nothing, it's now 90.25 to nothing. Not as strong evidence. So this is another example. Hooper also used this, and it's another example of Dempster's rule. So this is a kind of an idea about what belief functions are about. Here's another example. Here's the example of contradiction. And we could put an auditing example here too, but I didn't have that handy when I was making the slides, so I just told a little story about two witnesses contradicting each other. So in this case, one of them says a limb fell on my car, and the other one says it's not true, a limb didn't fall on your car. So both of these we give a well, this slide is not too complete, but the idea underlying it is that Betty is 90% reliable and Sally is 90% reliable. But the other 10% is don't know. So the 90% reliability means that when they tell us something, they're accurately reporting. The 10% is they're not reporting accurately or reliably, but it might still be true. They just don't know what they're talking about. So the probability that only one of them is reliable, the probability that Betty is reliable and Sally is not, is 90% times 10%. That's 9%. And also 90% times 10% would be the probability that only Sally is reliable. And there is and then you have 10% times 10% that neither is reliable. But then you've got, what about the 90% times 90% that both are reliable? Well, a priori, when you started, you would think there's 90% times 90% probability they're both reliable. They're independent witnesses, they weren't colluding, they came from different directions. But they can't both be reliable because one of them's wrong. They're contradicting each other. So you do what we call conditional probability, and we eliminate that 81%. So we have to divide everything by 1 minus 81, or 19%. So we end up with a probability of 9/19 that a limb fell in my car, 9/19 that a limb didn't fall in my car, and 1/19 that we don't know. So this is another example of Dempster's rule. So those are 3 simple examples of Dempster's rule. I could also talk about the Bayesian ways of analyzing this problem, but that's not my thing so much today, and so I'll pass over that, but we can interpret it in the same kind of ways as thinking about canonical examples and having a design to combine the examples. So I do have these people. As I said, it's actually, the Dempster Schaefer design is actually older than the Bayesian design. In addition to Hooper, well, here I have 1699, but he actually published it earlier. And then Bernoulli, a very famous mathematician, published some similar examples later, and so did a German scientist named Lambert. Hooper was a funny story. When I first started working on this, nobody knew who published this 1699 paper. It was an article in a paper short article in the Transactions of the Royal Philosophical Society in England, and it was anonymous. Nobody knew who had written it. That is to say, nobody among the statisticians and the people that studied probability theory knew who had written it. Later on, it turned out that there were other people who did know who had written it, namely the theologians, because George Hooper was a famous theologian, and in his collected papers, he had written similar things even before 1699. So it was known to a certain group of people, and it got sorted out. Okay, so I'm going to give a more complicated example to illustrate how we can use Dempster Schaefer. And this is an example that I published long ago, and it's based on a house I lived in 1978. Actually, in Kansas, out in the country in Kansas. And this house was located. It was out in the country. There were no other houses right around it. It was down on the corner of a 10-acre property that I lived in with my wife and I and 2 young children lived there in the late 1970s and early 1980s for about 10 years. And this house, is like a lot of houses, had been built onto. Somebody had started with, well, there were 3 parts to it, and this part I knew is the part you see out here in front. This is a garage back behind, but this part here extends back where you can't see, was a recent addition. I knew that. The people that I bought it from had told me that. You could tell it was added on. And then there were 2 rooms here that were older. This room, actually, there was a bathroom right here, I think. This was divided up a little bit, but these 2 parts were older. This part had an oak floor under it, and this part had a concrete floor. And they were the older part of the house, but they seem not to have been built at the same time either. So the question that I was interested in was which one was built first? Now, actually, I was interested in a different question. I wanted to take this wall out. There was a wall here, and I was worried that I wanted to enlarge this room, or at least the part of this and part of this. I wanted to put it together so I could have a bigger kitchen. And I was worried about taking that wall out because it might have been an original outside wall before the house was built onto.
And then the house, and then the whole room.
So I started gathering some evidence about which part of this house was built first. So one item of evidence was, this is just, you call this evidence. I said the partition was probably originally an outside wall. If the 2 parts were, if one part was built first and you was added onto, why take out the wall if you're going to add onto it? You already got a wall there, why take it out and put a new wall in? So it's probably the original outside wall. That's evidence, that's based on my ideas about how houses are built onto. I mean, I wasn't born yesterday, I grew up in that part of the country, I know, but it can be any place in the world people build onto houses. They start with what they have and they keep building onto them. Another thing I did was under the concrete floor, you know, I looked at the crack here. Well, for one thing, I crawled under this part of the house, and this part back here, I could crawl under. And it looked like to me there was a concrete foundation under this wall. And I couldn't see a crack between the concrete floor and the concrete foundation. Now maybe there was one, it just wasn't quite in my view yet. Maybe, but I couldn't find a crack. If there was a crack, it was farther over underneath the wall, or I couldn't see it. But I was pretty sure, I wasn't positive, but I was pretty sure that the wall was actually sitting on that concrete floor, not on a separate foundation or separate footing. And the footing that was under the oak floor didn't seem to me to be strong enough to support an outside wall. That was, yeah, that's just the way it looked to me. And also I climbed up, oh, here's the killer. I climbed up in the attic, and it looked like there were some old stubs there were old wooden, these pieces of wood that were cut off. I call them stubs of wood. It looked like they'd been cut off, so if they'd gone on up, they would have been rafters under an old roof. So it looks like there was an old roof that was removed, and then a bigger roof was put on to go over both parts. There's another item of evidence was I talked to a neighbor, and he told me, this neighbor who I half trusted, only half trusted, I didn't, he said that he thought that this original building was the office for a quarry. Now, you know what a quarry is? It's where you dig in the ground for rock or gravel. So in this case, the quarry was probably they were digging gravel to put on roads. So you need when you build a quarry, you want to sell the rock. So people come with their trucks to load up the rock, and you got to weigh the rock. Well, what you do is you have scales. You have scales to weigh, like you're getting on scales to weigh how much you weigh. But in this case, you weigh a truck. So you drive your truck. How many of you have ever been at a quarry? So let's see. How many of you grew up in the country? I know that many of you are not from the United States. But did you grow up in cities? Did you grow up in cities or in the country? How many of you grew up in the country?
I grew up in Oregon.
In Oregon. In a city?
I guess so. Eugene, Oregon.
Eugene.
Second largest city, but it's
I
Oregon,
guess so. Oregon, you guess.
But it's Oregon, so I don't know.
It's kind of rural. I've been there. They have good land zoning in Oregon, though. You can't live out. A lot of states in the United States, if you lived in a city around, Eugene, a lot of people would live out in the country. But in Eugene, you're zoned, and you can't just build a house out in the country like you can in Kansas. So, see, I know something about Oregon. I don't know too much about China, but anyway, out in the country, so I knew about quarries. I knew that, you've got to have a scales that you weigh the truck, then you load the truck up with the gravel, and then you weigh the truck again. And so you see how much gravel there was, and you pay for the gravel. So a quarry office has to have a scales alongside it. And those scales, there's a pit of the ground where you have the mechanism, and then so all that's made out of concrete. So if you're going to have a quarry office, you need a lot of concrete work. So I figured that if you built a quarry office, the floor would be concrete. So all these are reasons for me to think that the concrete floor was the first floor there. But none of these arguments by themselves, there's really the business about this footing not being good enough, looks like there's no crack, the stubs might have been rafters, but maybe they were, I'm not sure that I knew what I was seeing, and then this neighbor that I only half trusted. All these things are, but you put them all together, I thought they were pretty strong. So I thought the concrete section came first. And so the idea is we could combine all these by Dempster's rule. This is a kind of example that I originally gave this talk to philosophers. And in fact, when I was in Munich just now, I was talking largely to philosophers also. So one of the things one of my points was the evidence doesn't consist of propositions. The evidence is things I see, things I hear about, my overall experience with life. I grew up there, as I was saying, I grew up in the country. I had some ideas how things work from other things I'd seen. And the 5 statements I made are only summaries. I've got visual impressions. I mean, there's also the, down not on that property, but on the neighbor's property, there was kind of a mess that could have been a quarry. So maybe there was a quarry there. I've got my, how do I evaluate this neighbor's reliability? I talked to the guy, he didn't seem to quite all be there to me. And I've got my memory of similar situations about how quarry offices are built. I had an uncle who traveled around the country building these scales for quarries, for trucks to be weighed on. So I knew something about that. This is my.
If the house falls on it, does that he blames Mr. Bays? No, Reverend Bays, wasn't it?
Reverend Bays, yeah.
Reverend Bays.
Yeah.
Or Mr. Schaefer Dempster.
So there's several issues here. So first of all, I need to set up my set of possibilities. So now I kind of make it kind of technical. I got 3 issues. Was the concrete section built first or the oak section? This is really my focus. I want to know how much should I believe A. But I've also got the question is whether the partition is on a concrete floor or on a separate concrete footing. That's B. I've got C, whether the partition was the wall, formerly, outside wall, or whether that was somehow outside wall was removed. Now, if you have 2 by 2 by 2 possibilities, that gives altogether 8 possibilities. So what I called my frame of discernment set of possibilities would have 8. But one of them I thought was just too crazy. And that is A complement and B and C. So if the oak section was built first, but the partition was on the concrete floor, and it was formerly the outside wall. What that would say was that somehow the oak section was built first, and this partition was on the oak section, but they jacked it up and put a concrete floor underneath it. Nobody would do that. So, okay, so there's a bit of, you've got to do some simplification and say for 100% I rule that out. So I ruled that out, so I would only have these 7 possibilities, which I called A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And when I do that, A, B, E, F is the same as A, D, E is B, etc. So this is kind of a long list, so I made a picture that maybe works a little better. So here's my condition A, the concrete section was built first. Here's my condition B, the partition is on the concrete floor. Here's C, the partition is the outside wall. So, little a is all 3 things are true. And I suspect that all three things are true. But I'm not really so interested in all 3 being true as in whether the concrete section is built first. And that has some other possibilities in it. So that's what I'm aiming at. So I look at my items of evidence. The partition is probably the outside wall. Well, that's C. I'm going to give a certain degree of belief to, just on how things work, that the partition would be the outside wall. They wouldn't have discarded, taken it away, and replaced it. The concrete this is that I couldn't see a crack. That's supporting B. The partition is on the concrete floor. The footing on the oak floor is inadequate. That supports A, B, C, E, F. A, B, C, E, F. And the attic stubs, say the roof went over the concrete section, that would support A, B, or E. The neighbor says the office was for a quarry, and I think that supports it being the concrete coming first. So I guess you would have to puzzle over this to see about my statements about what these different items of evidence support. And then I score them using my canonical examples. So in each case, my canonical examples is the simple one where, the partition is from the outside wall. I put 80% on that. 80% on it supporting C, and 20% don't know. So in each of these cases, I've got a certain amount of my belief on what is being supported, and a certain amount of belief don't know. And then I multiply it all out. And when I multiply it all out, combined by Dempster's rule, and I get 98% belief in the concrete floor. So, so here's where I multiply them all out. Here I'm multiplying them all out, and I got 32 rows. I don't even show them all. Now, you could also do this, I wanted to emphasize, you could also do this in a Bayesian. You could also have a Bayesian approach. Now, in the Bayesian approach, so if you take my course next semester, I guess I'll spend more, or next year, I'll spend more time on this. But the first thing you have to do is, the Bayesian approach talks about old evidence and new evidence. You're supposed to have prior probabilities based on the old evidence, and then you update based on the new evidence by Bayes' theorem or Bayes' rule or the rule of conditioning. So you got to decide what's the old evidence and what's the new evidence. Well, here's a secret about Bayes, is that you make that up. It's not really true that the old evidence is what you knew before and the new evidence is something that comes later. You kind of look at the problem and you divide your evidence, just like I divided my evidence here. You divide your evidence and say, well, I'll consider this my old evidence and use it to get my prior probabilities, and then I'll update it with this new evidence. So what do we decide the old evidence is? Here's my 5 items of evidence. What's going to be my old evidence? So a convenient choice. I mean, you can make up your own Bayesian analysis. That's part of the point of this lecture. It is something we make up. It's something when we're assessing evidence, this doesn't come given to us already. We got to make it up, and that's the nature of probability judgment. I'm not trying to say it's a bad thing. So this business about the partition probably being the outside wall, you know, I could call that my old evidence. It's really no older than the rest of it, except it's something I thought about and convinced myself of, that I believe that 80%. So we can call that the old evidence. And we've got this new evidence. Each of these items, we know what they support. We call that our new evidence. And based on the old evidence, we got to assign prior probabilities to each of the possibilities. So the partition probably being the outside wall, I said, okay, I believe that, let's say I believe that 96%. But then I got to decide, because the partition being the outside wall, that's number C here. So I got to divide my probability, my 96% probability, among those three things. And I said, well, I'll just divide it equally. What do I know? So this is part of the process. So I'm being a little bit, so part of my message, obviously, is I like the Dempster Schaefer better than the Bayesian approach. And I see more arbitrariness. I mean, you saw those arbitrary numbers I gave for Dempster Schaefer, but at least they measured how strong I thought these items of evidence were. Here I'm kind of reduced to making a lot more kind of judgments about how to make prior probabilities. And then once I've got the 96% here, I may as well take the other 4% and spread it evenly over these four possibilities. So those are my prior probabilities. And then the new evidence I do in terms of likelihoods. So how many of you know the term likelihood or likelihood ratio? One person, or two people? In your probability and statistics course, are you study the word likelihood?
Likelihood?
Pardon?
In statistics, of course, I learned before.
Yeah.
Likelihood method, maximizing likelihood.
Maximum likelihood. So did you, in the case, did you learn how the Bayesian method multiplies prior probabilities times likelihood ratios? So I won't take the time to tell you all. Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. So professor is setting a bad example here. So I'm not going to take the time to teach the whole Bayesian point of view. It's very standard, and some of you have had it in statistics. So you take the prior odds and multiply them by likelihoods. And the likelihood is how much likely. What is the likelihood is what's the probability of seeing this evidence under the hypothesis. And the likelihood ratio is how much more likely it is to see the evidence under this hypothesis than that hypothesis. And that's what matters here. We got to say this evidence 2, the concrete under the partition is apparently part of the concrete floor. In other words, I couldn't see the crack. How likely is it, how much more likely is it that I couldn't see the crack if there was one than if there wasn't one? Well, I say 100 to 1. So that's where this 100 comes from. It doesn't matter. These are the three A, D, and E. A, D, and E. That's up here where the partition is on the concrete floor. There isn't a crack. I can't see a crack because there isn't any. So that's 100 times more better, you know. So if there really was a crack, the probability that I couldn't see it, I figured was 99%. So there's 100 to 1 more likely that I couldn't, that, you know, if I didn't see it at all, if there wasn't a crack, it'd be 100%. So that's 100 times more likely. So that's where I get this 100 to 1 from. The other items of evidence I thought were weak. Well, this one I thought was only 2 to 1. This was 100 to 1. This was 1.5 to 1. This is that neighbor that I didn't have too much confidence in. I only thought it was 1.5 times more likely that he would say that if it was true than if it wasn't. So those are the numbers. Now, you do all that calculation, you multiply the prior odds times the likelihoods, the posterior probability is 98%. So I fixed the numbers so they came out the same. So the 98% belief in A is the same as I would have for the belief function calculation. So, you got to do something with the numbers. Now the difference is when you come out the same for the overall conclusion, in this case, little a, this possibility that all 3 are true is actually 96%. And the next most likely possibility, E, what is E? E is the possibility that the concrete floor came first, and the partition is on the concrete floor, but it wasn't the original outside wall. That E there is the second most likely thing. And here it's only got 3%. But if you go back to the belief function result, and you look at the final results, you see that even though there was a degree of belief that the concrete floor came first of 98%, that's this capital A, which is equal to AEBF. That was also 98%, but in this case, we had 13% on A. Well, we had 18% on A or E, little a or little e. So, and only 78% on little a. So the Bayesian calculation came out 96% on little a, but this one only came out 78% on little a. So the belief function is being more conservative, even when we've adjusted it so the overall conclusion is the same. Still, it's less certain about what's going on inside that story. So this is a kind of indication of how the belief function, in some sense, it uses less assumptions. I didn't use these, these prior probabilities that the Bayesian uses. You didn't use those. You don't need that kind of what looks like to me phony detail. But when you add in that phony detail, it kind of nails down your probabilities on things more. Whereas the belief function approach can be more conservative about what you believe and about what you would bet on, or about what betting odds you think are safe. That's the general idea. So this is quite, as I said, belief functions remain popular. I just wanted to show some pictures of some other professors that worked on belief functions. There was another friend of mine, and not a co-author, Philippe Smets, who was very, very active in studying Dempster Schaefer. He was in Brussels. He was at the Free University of Brussels, of Belgium, from about from the late 70s, very early, right after I published my book, for about, well, nearly 30 years, 25 years, he was the most active person publishing. He died in 2005 of brain cancer. A lot of my friends have, that's what happens at our age. Jean-Yves, all these people that died. So here's another person who was a very close friend and a collaborator. He was in Paris, and he was a very big, he worked a lot on decision theory with belief functions. He died in 2009 of pancreatic cancer. So this guy is a Swiss, Jörg Kolas. He wrote books about belief functions. He is retired and he's still alive. And he's still writing books. So that's a happy story. Jadim Jirosek is a Czech He works in Prague, and he's still alive and active, and he is hosting, I mentioned this Belief Function and Application Society. In November, they're meeting for the fourth time or fifth time or something, and he is hosting the meeting. Chuanhai Yu is a professor in the statistics department at Purdue University in Indiana. And he's very active in this theory now and has published a book of his own about it. He's very active. He was from China, but as you see from his birth date, born 59, wasn't that late? But he had, because of the Cultural Revolution, he had trouble. He was in the first generation that went back to school in China, but at a late age. He didn't start school at a normal time, so he was kind of self-taught in mathematics. But somehow he ended up at Harvard, and he did a PhD at Harvard with Professor Dempster without ever having gone to college. He had not studied really at college, but he'd gone to some school or other and taught himself mathematics. And now he's a professor of statistics at Purdue. And Thierry Deneux is a professor in France, and he's the president of the Belief Functions and Application Society, and he's the editor-in-chief of a journal that publishes a lot of articles on belief functions, the International Journal of Approximate Reasoning. So these are just some of the people. I should have put my friend Prakash Shenoy, who's still at the University of Kansas, who's still working with Professor Jirosek, a co-author of mine. So there's a lot of people working. Apologies to all the people I didn't mention here. A lot of people working on belief functions, in addition to Professor Gillett and Professor Srivastava, but they're the ones that are doing the most in accounting. So I'm going to give a break now.